Hey fam, good morning and welcome to another 7-minute social. Today I want to jump into Acts chapter 16. We're going to be looking at two verses, Acts chapter 16 and looking at verses 25 and 26. And so here's what it says. It says, about midnight, so around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the prisoners were listening to them. All right, so they're all in prison. Paul and Silas are in prison. They've been whipped, they've been beat, and yet they are finding space to still worship God, right? And there's other prisoners that are in that prison, and they're listening to them. And suddenly, there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately, all the doors were opened and everyone's bonds were unfastened. So imagine now, Paul, Silas, they're in prison. And so while they're there about midnight, they're just worshiping God and praising God. And while they're worshiping and praising God, all of a sudden an earthquake, right, began to tremble. And that earthquake opens all of the gates or the doors that had been keeping all the prisoners locked up, as well as whatever had them fastened, boom, broken, unfettered, unchained. So today I basically want to talk about two things. One is the nature of grace, the nature of God's grace. And I also want to talk about the impact that you and I have on people who aren't necessarily asking for that impact. I once heard that, so here's Paul and Silas, they're praising God. And somebody once said that God inhabits the praises of his people, right? God inhabits the praises of his people. I believe, I'm not sure exactly where that is actually, so you have to look it up. There's some homework there for you. I want to say it's in the Torah that it says that God inhabits the praises of his people. Maybe it's in Psalms. But so somebody once suggested that because God inhabits our praise, right? That while they were singing praises to God in this little cell, in this little jail that they were in, because that little jail block is so tiny and God inhabits the praises of his people, that while Paul and Silas, even though they had just been beaten up and even though they had just been put in prison, that God literally inhabits that space, that area, and that space in that area was too small, right, to fit God in that little area, to fit God in that box. And so when God shows up, boom, stuff starts to break open, boom, stuff starts to opening up. And so there's that, perspective that's out there. But what I want to talk about is the nature of God's grace. And what I mean by that is Paul and Silas are the ones praising God. The other prisoners are not. They're just simply listening. But the nature of God's grace does not discriminate even when people are not necessarily the ones doing the praising. In other words, the nature of God's grace doesn't say, okay, I'm going to bless you if and only if. Or I'm going to set you free if and only if. Or I'm going to allow the gifts of my grace to benefit your life if and only if, right? It was only Paul and Silas who had been praising God from midnight. Boom, there's an earthquake. And all of the jail cells are now open. And all of their, whatever had been cuffing them, they're all now open. So everybody's free. And grace didn't say, that guy deserves to be free, but that guy doesn't deserve to be free. That guy deserves to be free, but that guy doesn't deserve to be free. It's almost like this idea of, have you ever heard of collateral damage? Right? When there's certain damage that's formed by maybe a person, but that damage is collateral because it's not only impacting that person's life, but anybody else's life that's around him when that person did that damage in that moment. Well, it's almost like grace, right? It's collateral grace. where anybody who's around in that moment, it doesn't matter if they're deserving or not deserving, worth it or not worth it. Grace in that moment does not discriminate. Grace, the grace of God comes and visits Paul and Silas, and anybody who's near them, there's collateral grace. In other words, there's enough grace to go around that even though those other prisoners were not the ones praising God, were not the ones singing, were not the ones praying, were not the ones adoring and lifting up God's name, even though they weren't doing it, grace didn't stop its benefit to everybody in that moment. And they're all in that moment set free, right? In that moment. And the story goes on that the jailer, once he woke up and realized what was going on, he was about to kill himself. But Paul said, hey, stop. We're all here. We're all still accounted for. Even though everyone is now technically free, we're all still here. So I just wanted to invite you to think about this week. If the nature of God's grace is that far-reaching, then maybe we should start thinking about how far-reaching God's grace is, not only in our life, but other people's lives who are around us, who may not necessarily be worshiping and praising like us, who may not be singing to God right at midnight, and yet that grace is still benefiting others. Right? What does that say about Paul and Silas, right? That even though they're the ones who are doing it, nobody else is doing it, that others are still reaping that same benefit. And I'm not going to sit here to give you an answer as to what exactly that means. I want you to think about. I want you to pray about, God, what does that mean? That these men were singing praises to your name, not the other men. And even though the other men in prison weren't, they still were participating, right? They were still included in the benefits of your grace. All right, that's all I wanted to say. I hope you have a blessed week. And please put in the comment box what you think. What does that mean? What does that look like in our life? Not only here personally, but also in the lives of those around us. And how far-reaching your influence and your impact can have on other people's lives. All right, we'll see you today. We'll see you in just a couple days.